Okay, so this video is going to be kind of influenced by this car and the performance that it had the other day. So I just put a Holley Terminator X on this car, so I wanted to go through my initial impressions on the Holley Terminator X, and I kind of want to combine two videos that I was going to do, comparing it to like my thoughts on other systems. I spent a lot of time with HP tuners, not a lot of time, like a couple years. But I wanted to give my initial impressions and kind of add the comparison into the same video. So this is the second setup on the car. If you guys don't know about this car yet, I've had the car for almost 12 months now. It's about 50 weeks. So in 2 weeks, it will be a year that I had this car. So bought it completely gutted as a roller. It was a drag car in its prime, had a cage, everything, but everything else was gutted. No engine, no transmission. No like floor pan in the trunk, like everything was complete, just a shell. So finished welding up the tube front, got it running, driving, took it to the track September of last year on a different setup. So I had different twins on it, a different ECU, old transmission, no trans brake. So did all that stuff over the last couple months and took it to the track the other day on the Holley Terminator X. And on the third pass, it went a 9.8. And I drove it, the first time I drove it on that setup with these twins and that ECU and the trans brake was like 6 hours before I made that pass. So that's an interesting thing, and I want to talk about that. Well guys, I promise, I tried really, really hard on this video, and I wanted to make it really cool and nice. So I actually made a PowerPoint presentation to go over everything, and then I was going to go over screenshots of both programs. But for some reason, my OBS software is not working at all, and it stopped recording audio for some reason. So this is actually the second time that I'm recording this video. And I spent about 45 minutes yesterday. Can you see me? I spent about 45 minutes yesterday recording this same video with the screen capture and everything. It was glorious, but it didn't record any audio. So I did an update on the computer yesterday. It was like one of those mandatory Windows updates, and that messed up a bunch of stuff. Like I lost my cursor, like I didn't have any mouse, and I lost a bunch of audio settings, and yeah, so this is my third day trying to make this video, so give it a like if you enjoy it, because at this point I'm pretty frustrated. I'm kind of over it. So trying to make a video, dude. Trying to make a video, man.
I'm taking it out of the car. I don't want to go all over your guy.
Okay, yeah, he's getting the lemon drops. Like I said, I'm totally over this video, but a lot of people have been asking for it, and I feel like it's a good video. I'll try to make it quick. I would like to actually go through some more stuff on this one. And maybe set it up as a live stream or something so we could talk about stuff. So this is beginner perspective and my initial impressions on Terminator X versus HP tuners. Gonna talk about some stuff, and I had a lot of questions about what I think about it. So what I did was I took it to the track, and I didn't want to make the video on my initial impressions until I was able to drive it on the street and take it to the track and make some adjustments. So I had a good understanding and comparing the two. So I'm kind of making two videos right now. One is my initial impressions, and one is like the comparison to HP tuners. And I'm just gonna make sure that the thing is actually recording because I'm not a very lucky boy. So I broke it down, as you saw before. I had it broke it down into 3 sections: cost, user experience, and capability. So essentially, the Terminator X, depending how you do it, is going to be cheaper than doing HP tuners, getting an ECU harness, and depending if you're going to like pay somebody to tune it, you're going to be well over that with HP tuners, especially with buying a wideband. So like my example that I have on the Ranger about HP tuners, I had like harness. I got it running NA first before I turboed it. And so I paid like $75 to have the VATs deleted, and then later bought HP tuners, and then bought a wideband, and I was racing it, so I bought the MSD two-step, and that's $250. The wideband is $150. You could pay up to $600 for a harness, depending if you like the wiring or not. The China harnesses are $300. HP tuners is $650. So depending what you want to do, I mean, it's going to add up pretty quick. So with the Terminator X, what I have in here is the Terminator X. It's not the X Max. It doesn't have transmission control or drive-by-wire. That's an extra $300, so $1,300. But for my setup, it was basically $1,000. Call it that. So you get the ECU. You have full capability of tuning. You get the harness, plug-and-play harness with any type of injector that you want. I put driving tune on here because basically $0. So like if you used HP tuners, you can get a decent tune off of the tune repository from HP tuners or the Sloppy Mechanics tune cabinet. You can get a pretty good running bass file off of that to get it driving. So I put $0 on both of those. But the big difference is going to be the wizard on the Terminator X. So yeah, you could flash a tune, but you still might have issues. So you might get one that's kind of close, but even differences of like your intake piping, your exhaust, slight differences in your injectors, those could cause like idle surging issues, and that's what people struggle with a lot, is just getting stuff running and idling. So with the X Max, you run through the wizard, and I did it on a video, and guys, my setup was really messed up when I ran through the wizard. I inputted the wrong fuel pressure. I had 3 vacuum leaks because I didn't have my old boost gauge line hooked up, and I was missing 2 vacuum lines for the wastegate. So I had 3 vacuum leaks, and I was running E85 ethanol fuel on a gas scale tune, and it was correcting 30%, and the idle air motor just fixing it, and it idled and ran. Like, it was a little high on RPM, but it just idled. And I'd have that on a previous video if you want to go look at it, which is kind of wild because sometimes it's not that easy. Like with HP tuners, it can be not that easy. So I'm trying not to make this a biased video because people have been asking a lot about, should I transition over from HP tuners to this? And people are also asking because they're wanting to get involved and don't know which direction to go. So I'm trying not to be very biased here. So user experience, Terminator X versus HP tuners. So installation on the Terminator X is pretty quick. So you have a switch power, constant power, a ground, and then you have a main harness that has a power and a ground, and you have 2 ground connection harnesses for the heads, like wires for the heads. So it's pretty quick. The startup, you go through the startup wizard, you input like stuff like, what is your target idle speed? What size is the motor? What size injectors? Do you have a turbo? What map sensor? And there's a lot of drop-down settings for a bunch of different stuff, and you can just pick what you have and run through what you want to do. It goes through target air-fuel ratio, target air-fuel ratio at 0 manifold vacuum, at 7 pounds, 14 pounds, 21 pounds if you have a power adder, and you can put in target air-fuel ratio and timing and basically just go drive the thing after you set it up. So that's kind of cool. Next thing I have is SD card and no laptop. So I have the Terminator X handheld right here, if you guys haven't seen this before. And this thing is still connected to the harness on the passenger side floorboard in the car. So it's a pretty long harness. So you slide this thing up, and then you have the SD card that just slides in right here. So as far as tuning goes, you can kind of set everything up, and then if you want to actually look at it on the computer, you just pop it out and you click download from ECU, you take it out, put it in the computer. And honestly, I didn't think I was gonna like the SD card, and I think it was just because I'm not used to it. So I really realized that I do like it for two reasons. The one day my laptop was dead, and that happens a lot of times when I'm on my way to the track, as I go out for a drive before I go to the track and my computer's dead and I'm struggling to like keep it charged, my laptop, because I'm irresponsible and I know that. So I was able to keep my laptop at home, still go out, data log, collect everything that I needed to do, and it works out pretty good that way. And then at the track, when I was making changes, and it really clicked in my head. You see a lot of pictures like it. Well, I see personally a lot of pictures of like people at the track, and they're just like standing outside the car and they have the laptop on the roof of the car and they're just like looking at the logs and stuff. And 9 times out of 10, you see Holley software on that computer, which makes sense because, you could be using an SD card and just standing outside the car and going through the tune. I'm used to being connected to a cord the whole time because I was using the HP Tuners MVPI-1 Pro model, so I was always in the vehicle connected to a cord. Data logging on the Terminator X, it has an auto logging feature in there. So like HP Tuners had, the MVPI-1 has like a play button you could push on it, and it had some auto logging features. But the Terminator X, there's like you go to a log, you push logging, and then there's like a check mark. You check the thing to enable it, and then you can put in different parameters, whatever parameters you want. So over a certain RPM, over a certain throttle position. So like what I selected was like 60% throttle position. So assuming you just, like you're in the staging lanes for racing, you turn a vehicle on, you pull into the burnout box, and you have an auto setting feature that is going to start data logging when you get over 60% throttle. So you mat the thing to do the burnout, you're over 60% throttle, it automatically starts your data log, and then you don't have to worry about touching anything. You can just focus on driving the car. So that thing is pretty cool. Next thing I have on the list is safety. So I feel like it's relatively safe when you're driving it, probably safer than anything that I've really experienced before, because there's amazing closed loop correction for fueling, but it's also building like a learning table in the background. So it's one thing to correct the fueling, but it's also telling you what it did on a different table, so you can study the table and then make changes, or you can just transfer it over there. So you could take it out and be extremely irresponsible, run it through the wizard, and basically like I did when I had ethanol in it and stuff and it was off by 30%, and go out and drive it. And as long as your target air fuel ratio is set up where you want it to be, it's going to pretty much go to target. So I think the highest variation that I've seen while it was correcting was about a half of an air fuel ratio point. So it's pretty tight in the correction that it's doing, which is pretty good. So then the interface, everything like the program that you download, it's a free download. It's pretty easy to understand. So on the other hand, HP Tuners, there's a lot of tables and there's a lot of kind of complicated things that I feel like people can get confused by, because there's a lot of stuff that you're not going to use. So it's difficult to understand the stuff as you go through it. So run it through the HP Tuner side. What I think is good about it, I mean, there's a lot of information about there. So a lot of information out there. So if you're actually interested in learning how to tune, it's a good thing, which I actually think could be a downside for the Terminator and some of the Holley stuff, is that it's so good at correcting and adjusting that if you're interested in like actually understanding the fundamentals of tuning, you might not learn some things because a lot of it is just taken care of for you. So if you're like struggling with a cold start or struggling with surging or struggling with knocking or like other stuff, you might not learn as much. So the thing with HP tuners and the Terminator, so the HP tuners it's separate from it. It's not just an ECU, guys. So like the Terminator X is an ECU specific for a vehicle. So HP tuners can be very beneficial because you can tune multiple vehicles. So if you want to tune multiple vehicles and that's what you're interested in doing, like I even use it sometimes on my other vehicles that I'm not tuning and I didn't do the license for, but you can use it just for diagnostic testing and like checking engine codes, and you can still set up a scanner without actually writing to the vehicle or using credits or anything. You can still read and see what's happening on other vehicles. So that's kind of cool, and that's something that I've actually done that quite a bit on other vehicles. Like my personal vehicles, like check engine light pops up, just throw it on the scanner and see what's going on because everything's broken. So that's kind of something that you would need to consider. Like you're talking about a tuning system versus a specific ECU. Another thing with HP tuners is you do have the flexibility with transmission control and drive-by-wire. So you can do like a segment swap and change your transmission. Where with the Terminator X, like if I decide I want to put a 4L80 in this thing someday, I have to change the whole ECU, which could be a little bit more expensive. So you got to know kind of what you want to do. One difference that would be beneficial for the Terminator X though is like the HP tuners is very specific to the engine type. So like Gen 3, Gen 4, 24X versus 58X, you have to have a specific harness and ECU for the engine. So with the Terminator X, you can select in a drop-down menu what crank you have. The harnesses are slightly different, but you can get adapters for it and you can just change it. So you wouldn't have to get like Lingenfelter converter box or anything like that if you decided, hey, I want to put an aluminum Gen 4 engine in it. You could just change it. So yeah, so I talked about that stuff. So now, like capability, I think this is the last page. So we're talking about capabilities. I'm just going to kind of run through the list. So the Terminator X is more performance oriented, I would say, where the HP Tuners is an emissions computer. So you can get good performance out of the HP Tuners, but it's designed and engineered to run a factory vehicle, and it's fully emissions capable. So that's another consideration, and where you see some other limitations. Like you're not going to have trans brake setup on HP Tuners. You're not going to have two-step options or boost control or like boost cut, any type of protections like that you would see on like a racing specific performance oriented Terminator X or any type of a Holley system. So I went through the crank positions or the cranks already. So like Holley, you can select between the two, and HP Tuners, it's specific to the computer, and there's only one direction that you can convert it with the Lingenfelter box. I talked about the protections. HP Tuners does have some protections, but they're kind of limited. So it's more like coolant temperature corrections, intake air temp corrections. Like if your intake air temp is 200 degrees, it's going to start to pull timing. So it has some timing protections and transmission torque management, stuff like that, which I think is kind of critical because I blew one engine because of overboosting and broke 3 rods on the engine. And like the first day that I took this car out, I was not really slow to get into the throttle, and I hit boost cut at 18 pounds that I had it set at like my second pull when I was out there. So I was kind of aggressive out there with it. And with HP Tuners, I would never think of going and running 18 pounds on a fresh tune that I just took out of the garage. So next thing would be inputs and outputs. HP Tuners doesn't really have any inputs and outputs, so you can't do like it already has built-in fan control, so you can do like fan adjustments, but you can't do specific outputs. Like I have a boost control output, I have a transmission fan output, and you can set them up where it's running off of RPM or it's running off of different specific parameters. So my transmission cooler fan, because I'm not reading, I don't have a sensor set up yet for transmission temperature. I have the transmission fan running all of the time with RPM, but my radiator fan doesn't run the same way. Right now I have it running every time that it's, anytime the ignition is on, but I know that I'm going to be sitting and watching it all the time. So I did have a situation with HP Tuners one time where this is where it can be good to be able to change it to run with RPM. Is I have a live stream actually, I think, when my battery died, because I was out writing a couple files and I had my ignition on and I was doing stuff with HP Tuners, and my fan was running the whole time because the engine was hot and the battery died. And I think I have a live stream of that. So that happened to be a couple times I got burned with the thing running. But you can set up different inputs and outputs and parameters and all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of really, with the Terminator X and Holley stuff, you can really get as creative as you want to. So one thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to be adding a coolant pressure sensor. So if I start to like lift a head, or head gasket is starting to go and you're putting exhaust gas into the coolant passage, it will cut the engine off. So it's kind of just another safety thing that you can add that's pretty cool to do. So we talked about vehicle specific and like a tuning system versus ECU. We talked about the closed loop fueling. So one thing with HP Tuners that I like to do, I was a big fan of like the AFR error histograms. But that's kind of a complicated table that you have to set up and make sure everything's right. But it tells you what your target air-fuel ratio is versus what your actual is off of the wideband, and it gives you that calculated error so you can take that table and copy it into your main VE table. So Terminator does that in two different ways. So it has the learn table that it's populating all the time as it's learning, and it's telling you what it did, but it has that extra safety feature of the closed loop correction in real time. So while you're driving it, you might be off quite a bit, but it's safe, but it tells you what it did so you can change it later on. So to add to my frustration, I finished the video and then I grabbed the camera and it said it ran out of memory. So now I'm gonna go over it again. So after the histogram section with copy and pasting HP Tuners, Terminator X is very easy to change the axes. So if you want to change RPM, like if you have this thing set up to rev to 6,000 RPM or you want to run to 8,000 RPM, you can just change the number. Where HP Tuners, you can't really change a lot of that. Like if you want to change the scaling on some of your tables, like your VE table, you can't just change the axis. You would have to do an OS upgrade for that to happen, and then you got to repopulate a bunch of other tables and stuff. So with the Terminator, you can just change it. Put it in there, rescale it, everything is fine. So that's pretty cool. The map sensor selection, you can just, it's like a drop-down menu. You just pick your map sensors. Again, HP Tuners, that would be like an OS upgrade, operating system upgrade, that you would have to do if you wanted to go from like 1 bar to 2 bar, 2 bar to 3 bar. Flex fuel on Terminator is just something that you enable. Flex fuel on HP Tuners can be something that you have to do like a segment swap for, or start with a different computer, and it can be kind of frustrating. So you have fuel limitations on HP Tuners, where if you're going to run a really big injector, you run out of table resolution, especially on your timing table. It runs out at like, your cylinder air mass runs out at like 1.2 on that table. So it's very easy to exceed that, especially if you're running a big injector. So if you're running like decapped injectors, you can be running at like 1.4, 1.6, and you just basically don't have the ability to change the timing at that point beyond the last line of the table. So it'll give you whatever timing is on the last line of the table, but you can't change anything in that range. So that might be a difference of like, I'm running 12 pounds of boost to 16 pounds of boost. You can't run anything different in there, any different timing, except for what the last line says. So maybe you want to run 14 pounds at this, or you want to run 14 degrees at this much boost, and then you want to pull a little bit more timing. You can't do that. It just runs whatever's at the last line. So you can kind of openly change your table resolution. Like with the big injectors at HP tuners, the E38 computers, I think it's maxed out at like 60 pounds or something like that. So you have to do a lot of scaling with your air tables, like your VE table and other airflow tables, to get that to work. You can run the big injector, but you really have to trick the computer into making it work, where the other Terminator is a little bit more performance oriented, and it knows that you're going to be doing that stuff. Another thing, I think the last thing I want to talk about is data. And I like to collect as much data as I can. I like to see data and look at stuff, and I like to be able to go back and learn stuff that I didn't even think about looking at before. So with the Terminator, you can do that. With HP tuners, you can't. So if you're brand new, and I remember this like a couple years ago when I was brand new with HP tuners, I'm like, I want to look at this, this, and this. But then I start racing, and I'm like, I want to look at this, 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 and this. So you can't compare some of your early logs to your later logs because you weren't logging that specific information. So if you want to look at like, say I didn't really care about intake air temperature because I didn't really care. I didn't really know anything about it. And how like a turbo setup affected intake air temperature. And then I learned that 6 months after my boosted setup. And I'm like, oh man, I wonder what my intake air temp was before. And now I changed my turbo, and I want to see if maybe because that's what happened to me. I started with a GT45 turbo, and then I went to a VS Racing 7875. So if you like did something like that where you change your setup and you want to see, well, what is this turbo doing versus what this was, but you were recording different data earlier, you can't go back and pull that data. The Terminator setup, you can go back and pull that data as long as the sensor and the information was there hooked up. You can go back and look at it. So that's what can be frustrating. Like with the intake air temp sensor on HP tuners, it's hooked up and the computer's reading it, but you can't go back and look at the log. Where same thing with the Terminator, it's hooked up, it's always reading, the computer's looking at it, but you can go back later and pull that information. So that's kind of cool. The other thing is with HP tuners, you have issues with data collection and freezing. So you can run into issues where you're recording too much data because you want to see everything, and it freezes or doesn't collect data very quickly, or it's not as responsive. So I had an issue. It wasn't my issue, but I talked to someone about it, kind of helped them with it. They were wondering why their timing was creeping up during a pull. So they mat it, and they're like 2 seconds into their pull, and then they were wondering why their timing is continuously creeping up to like 30 degrees at the end of their pull, which is pretty dangerous, especially when you're running boosted. It was another Turbo Ranger setup. And what ended up happening was it froze, and it just drew a straight line. But during that short data collection period, it basically draws a straight line from one data point to another data point. So while he was in the throttle, it should have been commanding, say, 13 degrees, but then the next data point it picked up was when he was out of the throttle, and then it put like you know, it was back at like 30 degrees coasting on the coast down. So it looked on the scan like, why is my truck continuously increasing timing as I'm going? But it was actually a frozen point in the data, and it just drew a straight line on the chart. So that's not something that you're really going to see, I don't think, on Terminator, because I think it's a little bit more designed for that. But that can happen in HB tuners, and it happened to me a lot. You go do a pull, and it's kind of frustrating because you go do a pull, and you're kind of nervous anyways because you're trying to get data, and you do a pull, and it's like, okay, it froze. You do another pull, okay, it froze. And then you're like figuring out what to do. So yeah, that's kind of my thought. So if you haven't gathered from the video, I like the Holley setup. I like the Terminator, I like the Holley software, and I'm honestly thinking about putting a Terminator X Max on my Ranger, which is it's a triple turbo. If you're not familiar with the truck, it's a triple turbo Ford Ranger with a 6-liter LS in it and a 4L80 transmission. So I'd like to maybe see what I could do with that with the Terminator, because I feel a lot more confident with the Terminator than HB tuners. Because even at the track with the truck before, I got the truck when it was a single turbo setup, I got it to an 11.0 at 124, but I was always very like small with my adjustments. Like I'd go out and I'd like with my boost controller, and with my boost controller, and you know, instead of being able to like enter, I'm gonna add some duty cycle, I'm gonna add some duty cycle. And I had one situation at the track where I turned it like a little tiny bit and it added 6 pounds, and that can be kind of unpredictable at times with a little ball and spring manual controller, and there's no boost cut. So I'm paranoid and freaked out. There's no air fuel ratio correction. It's just like, you don't know what you're doing. So I just feel like it would be quicker to get to the same point, essentially. So I'm not afraid to take the time to like make the changes, but I want to me personally, I do them slowly, because of what I've learned over time with like, if you do too much too quick, or you have the wrong timing here, then you break stuff. And but it took me doing that and breaking stuff to learn it. So I'm not saying that it's gonna like completely eliminate all of your issues. It definitely can still cause some issues, but you'll be a little bit safer. So I think that's where I'm gonna leave it. Hopefully this actually recorded what I'm talking about. If not, I'm gonna lose my mind. So thanks for watching. Have a good one.